He thought she was just a server in a cheap uniform. So he demanded a performance not out of admiration, but mockery. What he didn't expect was the music that followed. It didn't just silence him, it exposed him. And by the time her final note hung in the air, the entire room would remember her name, not his. It was a warm Friday evening at Bellamy's, the kind of place where stemware sparkled, where laughter echoed like polished pearls, and where every detail whispered wealth. Outside, the Spanish moss swayed gently in the Georgia dusk. Inside, time moved slower, each course part of a curated experience, not a meal. Amara moved through it all like a shadow stitched into silk. At 27, she carried herself with a quiet rhythm: step, pause, paw, smile. Her uniform was crisp, her posture perfect, and her presence barely noticeable, unless you were watching closely. Some guests did. Most didn't. To them she was simply another waitress. Efficient, pleasant, invisible, but beneath the tidy apron and calm voice was something Bellamy's couldn't see. She didn't come here for the tips, not really. She came because of the old violin tucked away in the back closet, abandoned by a former lounge musician, and nearly forgotten by everyone else. Most nights she'd slip into the break room during her half hour, and press Rosen to bow, tuning strings, like you'd tune memory. She didn't tell anyone. She didn't need to. That violin didn't belong to Bellamy's. It belonged to her. Born and raised in Macon, Amara had grown up with church pews, call-used fingers, and Sunday morning solos that made the congregation still their hands in mid-prayer. Her mother worked 2 jobs, and still found time to teach Amara the basics after dinner, humming melodies, as Amara played them back one note at a time. By 14 she was playing Vivaldi, from memory. By 16 she'd won state competitions, and by 18 she had a full ride to Juilliard, waiting until the call came. Her father, stroke, severe, the kind that changed everything. The scholarship went unclaimed. Life didn't pause. She worked when she could, took care of him when she had to, practiced when there was time. But time had its own rules. And eventually dreams gave way to necessities. Now, here she was, plates in hand, name tag clipped, walking on carpet, so plush it muffled every step. But the music, it never left. Sometimes late at night, she'd hum a tune while polishing wine glasses, or tap out rhythms against the sink when the kitchen was loud enough to mask the sound. None of the guests ever noticed, but the dishwashers did. So did Terence, the bartender, who once paused mid-shift to say, "Girl, I don't know what you're hiding, but it's got notes in it." She smiled and shrugged, because what do you say to that? At Bellamy's, silence was safer. Here she was Amara the server, reliable, polite, unremarkable. But that night, something was about to change. Someone was going to see her, not for the tray she carried, but for the fire she never let burn out. The back room smelled faintly of lemons and old wood. It was where the staff stashed their coats, their tired jokes, and the 10 stolen minutes that barely counted as breaks. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, flickering just enough to remind you that the elegance outside didn't reach back here. In the corner, behind a stack of folded aprons and a crooked "employees only" sign, sat a scuffed black violin case. Nobody touched it. Most didn't even notice it. But for Amara, it was a lifeline. She'd found it her second week at Bellamy's, forgotten beneath an old shelf, its hinges rusted, its leather handle worn smooth by years of carrying. Someone had once loved it. She could feel that in the way the bow still rested neatly inside, as if waiting to be held again. The strings were dusty but intact. The body bore scratches like memory lines. She cleaned it carefully, slowly, like a ritual. And then she played. Not every day. Only when the air in her chest felt too tight. When the sound of clinking forks and hollow pleasantries started to drown out the parts of herself she fought to keep alive. On those nights, when the dining room dimmed, and the voices behind the kitchen door faded, she'd slip away during her break, and press the violin beneath her chin like an old friend. She never played for applause. She never played for show. She played because the music remembered who she was, even when the world didn't. Each note carried weight, of dreams deferred, of letters she never sent, of scholarship she couldn't accept. But the notes also carried light. Her mother's humming in the kitchen, her father's smile when she'd played Amazing Grace at his bedside. The slow burn of hope that never truly left, no matter how many years passed. She didn't talk about Juilliard. People didn't ask. Savannah wasn't the kind of town where waitresses talked about conservatories. And Bellamy's wasn't the kind of restaurant where people wanted to know who poured their wine. They just wanted it poured right. So she let them believe what they wanted. But in the quiet of the back room, her truth was louder than anything on the menu. Sometimes, Terence would pause outside the door and listen. He never said anything, just leaned against the wall for a minute, then slipped back to his bar post like it never happened. He once left a note on her locker that read, "Some people carry gold in their fingers. You're one of them." She never brought it up, but she kept it, tucked inside the violin case, where her real life lived, waiting. The front doors of Bellamy's opened with a gust of coastal air, and the kind of pause that follows power. A hush fell over the room, not obvious, but subtle. A shift in posture. A quick glance. Forks paused mid-lift. Even the hostess, usually unfazed by local politicians and Fortune 500 regulars, straightened her shoulders and checked her lipstick with a passing finger. Warren Kingsley had arrived. Tall, tanned, and drowning in designer arrogance. He stepped inside like he had personally paved the marble floors beneath him. His charcoal suit clung perfectly to his frame, the silk pocket square screaming wealth without whispering taste. His smile, measured, predatory, the kind that promised charm while quietly sizing up the worth of a room. Behind him trailed two men in near-matching suits. His entourage. One carried a briefcase. The other carried nothing but a phone, and the unspoken job of laughing at Warren's jokes. Amara clocked them the moment they walked in, not just because they were hard to miss, but because of the ripple they sent through the room. She'd been working long enough to recognize the type. Men who confused volume for value, who ordered drinks they didn't finish, and tipped only when someone watched. Warren spoke to the hostess with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Requested the best table near the piano, loud enough for nearby diners to hear. He didn't ask. He expected. That was his language. Entitlement fluently spoken. As they were led across the room, Amara instinctively took a half step back, pressing closer to the wall near the kitchen door. Not out of fear, out of wisdom. She'd dealt with men like him before. Wealthy, performative, amused by the discomfort they caused, and always hunting for someone to make small. Warren's eyes swept the room like a searchlight. Calculating. Hungry. Then they landed on her. A pause, brief but deliberate. Amara didn't flinch. She kept walking, tray in hand, chin steady, eyes soft. Just another table, just another night. But something in Warren's gaze lingered, like he'd already chosen her for something. She felt it before she understood it. Terence, from the bar, muttered under his breath as Kingsley passed. "Here comes trouble with a gold watch." Amara didn't answer. She didn't need to. The tension had already followed Warren to his seat like a second shadow. She continued her rounds, pouring wine, delivering entrees, folding napkins with muscle memory precision. But she could feel the shift in the air. Something was coming, something she hadn't rehearsed for. And Warren Kingsley, with all his swagger and showmanship, was already watching her like the opening act to a private game. Only he understood. It started with a smirk. Warren had been quiet for all of 10 minutes, long enough to scan the wine list, send a text, and interrupt one of his companions mid-sentence to correct their pronunciation of sommelier. But then his gaze drifted again, past the chandeliers, past the sleek piano in the corner. To her, Amara was moving between tables, balancing a tray of lemon spritzers and shrimp cocktail, like it was second nature. Her steps were smooth, unhurried. She didn't speak unless spoken to, didn't linger, didn't fawn, just floated, efficient, graceful, distant. It annoyed him. He liked women who performed for him, who bent their posture just a little, who laughed a little too loud when he teased. But Amara, she didn't flinch. Not when he ordered brusquely, not when he leaned too far into her space, as she poured his wine. He decided she needed humbling. "So," Warren said, loud enough to carry across 3 tables, "do they make you all take ballet classes to learn how to glide like that? Or is it just natural talent?" He didn't wait for her to respond, just leaned back in his chair, raising his voice with mock sincerity. No, wait. I bet she's got hidden talents. You know the type." He waved a hand in her direction like she was part of the decor. A novelty, a joke. The table erupted in laughter, not full, genuine laughter, but the kind men use when they want to stay on the right side of power. Shallow, compliant. Amara didn't stop walking. She placed the drinks gently on the next table, eyes on the coasters, mouth closed. When she finally turned toward Warren's table, she offered the faintest smile, the kind you wear when your dignity is armor, and your silence says more than any comeback ever could. "Just doing my job, sir," she said, smooth as silk. Warren chuckled. "Oh, come on. Someone with posture like that must be something more than just a server." He looked to his companions, fishing for a bigger laugh. Actress, dancer, maybe, violinist. The word hung there, heavy, too close to something real. Amara's chest tightened, but she didn't show it. She gathered their empty plates, nodded once, and turned toward the kitchen. Her spine stayed straight, her face unreadable, but inside, something cracked, something small and quiet, that had been holding her together all night. Not because of what he said, but because of how familiar it felt. She'd heard variations of that tone before, backhanded interest, laced with superiority. Men like Warren didn't see her, not really. They saw the outline of a person they could prod, dismiss, control, but this time was different. This time, she felt the weight of her violin in the back room, and the choice building in her chest. The wine in Warren's glass caught the chandelier's glow as he swirled it lazily, his fingers tapping the rim like he was waiting for the show to start. He wasn't watching the pianist in the corner anymore. He was watching her. Amara returned to his table with the check for their first bottle, just doing her rounds, eyes calm, movements practiced. She set the bill down between Warren and his nearest companion, nodded politely, and turned to leave, but his voice stopped her mid-step. "I hear you play the violin, sweetheart." She froze. The word sweetheart landed like an elbow to the ribs. Casual, patronizing, deliberate. He leaned back in his chair, letting the sentence stretch. "How about a little performance for us? I'm sure the other guests wouldn't mind." His voice was smooth, but the challenge underneath it was jagged. It wasn't curiosity. It wasn't interest. It was control, cloaked in charm. The table chuckled, the same practice sound they'd offered all evening. A few diners turned their heads. Others slowed their bites mid-chew. The pianist in the corner faltered slightly, sensing a change in the air. Even the manager peeked out from behind the bar, unsure whether to intervene or wait it out. Amara didn't answer right away. She faced him slowly, letting the silence stretch. "I'm here to serve dinner, not concerts," she said quietly, her voice even but firm. Her hands stayed at her sides, but her shoulders squared just slightly, enough for anyone paying attention to notice. Warren grinned wider, teeth flashing beneath the low lighting. "Oh, come on," he said, spreading his arms. "No need to be shy, we're all friends here. I just thought someone as poised as you might want a chance to shine." The way he said shine made it clear. He wasn't offering her a stage. He was daring her to embarrass herself. It was theater to him, a game. But to Amara, it was something else entirely. She felt the weight of the room shift toward her, not just the stares, but the expectations. Waiting to see what she would do, waiting to decide what kind of woman she was. The kind who bowed out quietly, or the kind who stood her ground. "I'm really not interested," she said again, her tone polite, but colder now. She turned to walk away. Warren raised his voice just slightly. "Ah, I see. All talk, no talent." The jab landed harder than the table expected. The laughter that followed was thinner this time, uncertain. Amara's jaw clenched, but she didn't turn around. Not yet. But she felt it building, that old fire, the one she buried under aprons, and shifts and empty smiles, the one that only came alive when wood met string, when pain met melody. She didn't owe him anything, but there was a part of her that suddenly deeply wanted to play. The room moved without her. Plates clinked, forks scraped china, ice settled in crystal glasses, but Amara stood still, half-turned, eyes fixed on nothing, the weight of Warren's words still hanging in the space between them, like smoke that wouldn't clear. All talk, no talent. The insult wasn't new, not exactly, but the timing of it, the tone shook something loose, something she usually kept tightly wrapped beneath layers of patience and protocol. Her past came back in fragments. The first violin she ever touched was rented. Her mother had picked it up from a second-hand shop downtown, the tag still dangling from the handle. Amara was 9, maybe 10, and already in love with the sound before she ever knew how to make it herself. She practiced in the living room, while her mother slept after night shifts, playing soft enough not to wake her, but loud enough to hear herself improve. She played at church the first time someone cried, during one of her solos. By 14, she was winning county-wide competitions, little plastic trophies and paper certificates that felt like keys to a better life. By 17, she was performing in the State Youth Symphony, the youngest in her section. Letters started arriving from conservatories. One, from Juliet, sat framed on her bedroom wall for a year. Then her father collapsed in their kitchen. Stroke, massive, unforgiving. Her mother aged 10 years in one phone call. And Amara, who had always believed talent could outrun circumstance, suddenly found herself trading sheet music for part-time jobs and hospital visits. The Juliet letter came with deadlines. The scholarship wouldn't wait. Life didn't pause for potential, so she let it go, not because she lacked the heart, but because family came first. She still played, when she could. At night. In borrowed spaces, on borrowed time. But the dream of standing on a concert stage, bowing in front of velvet curtains and thunderous applause, it faded, not out of bitterness, but necessity. Now, years later, here she was, serving lamb chops to men who didn't know her name, carrying memories in her chest like pressed flowers, beautiful but fragile. Warren Kingsley didn't know that. Couldn't. To him, she was just a quiet girl in black slacks and sensible shoes. A waitress who flinched at the spotlight. A woman with no stage to stand on. But he was wrong, because even though her hands carried plates instead of a bow, and her nights were spent wiping down counters instead of tuning strings, the music never left her. It was stitched into her bones, curled into the hollows of her silence. She wasn't frozen, because she was afraid. She was frozen because something old was waking up, and it wasn't going to stay silent much longer. Amara didn't speak. She didn't nod, didn't flinch, didn't dignify Warren's jab with a word. She just stood there a moment longer, still and unreadable, then turned and walked away. Not briskly, not in retreat, but like someone who'd just made a decision too big for words. The kitchen door swung behind her, muting the hum of the dining room for a heartbeat. The staff barely looked up. They'd seen her disappear back there before. But this time she didn't go to clock out or breathe through frustration. She moved past the lockers and the half-stocked shelf of soda syrups and into the far corner, where the old violin case waited beneath her coat. She knelt slowly, opened the latch. The hinges groaned like they too remembered. Inside, the violin rested exactly as she'd left it, cradled in frayed velvet. The wood was warm-toned and worn smooth in places. Not fancy, not flawless, but real, hers. She lifted it gently, pressing her thumb beneath the neck, fingers curling over the familiar weight. The bow came next. She tightened the hairs without thinking, rosined it once, twice. She didn't rush. If she was going to do this, she was going to do it on her terms. Back in the dining room, the air had shifted, conversations thinned into murmurs. Chairs creaked. A few guests leaned toward Warren's table, sensing something unscripted was unfolding. Warren grinned like a cat who'd cornered a mouse. He took a slow sip of his wine and tilted his head toward his entourage. "She's doing it," he said, smug and lazy. This should be fun. He didn't know. The kitchen door opened again, and Amara stepped out. No apron, no tray, just the violin in her left hand and a bow in her right. She moved through the dining room, like a thread pulled through silk. Every table she passed turned silent, forks lowered, glasses stopped mid-air. The pianist in the corner stood, uncertain, then stepped aside without being asked. Amara didn't acknowledge him. She took his seat. Her hands were steady now, her chest, still tight, but her eyes, focused. She tuned the strings in 4 clean, practiced motions. G-D-A-E, each one precise. Warren leaned back, one arm draped over his chair, eyebrows raised. "Well," he said, loud enough to break the quiet, "don't hold back on our account." Amara didn't look at him. She closed her eyes, took one breath, and lifted the bow. The room, the restaurant, the city, all of it, went silent. Because this wasn't just about proving a point. It was about remembering who she was, and letting everyone else feel it too. The bow touched the string like a whisper meeting skin. A single note floated out, fragile, almost shy. It wavered in the stillness, hovering above linen-covered tables and half-filled wine glasses. And then, another, clearer, stronger, a thread pulling taut. It wasn't a song anyone recognized. No Bach, no Mozart, no classical darling made for grand halls and polite applause. This was something older, closer, woven from memory. Amara didn't open her eyes. She didn't need to. The music had lived inside her long enough to guide her fingers blind. She let the first stanza unravel slowly, like breath after a sob. The notes curved downward, mournful, aching, but never collapsing. There was pain in it. Yes, but not the kind that begged for pity. It was the kind that survived. She had written it years ago, after her father's stroke, in the sleepless hours between hospital visits and shifts at a grocery store deli. She never gave it a name, never played it for anyone. It wasn't meant to be heard. It was meant to be felt. And now, it filled the dining room, like smoke through keyholes, quiet, but inescapable. Forks stilled. Conversations died mid-word. A couple near the window lowered their phones in unison. Even the bartenders stopped pouring. There was something in the way the melody rose and fell, like grief and hope braided together. A sound that didn't ask for attention, but commanded it anyway. Warren's smirk faltered. He shifted in his seat, glancing around as if searching for someone to validate what he was hearing. Someone to remind him that this was just a joke. But no one laughed. No one even blinked. The only thing moving in the room was Amara's bow, rising and dipping like a tide. The middle section came like a swell, rich, resolute. Her fingers danced up the neck of the violin, faster now, the notes tumbling over one another, like a heart racing toward something just out of reach. It wasn't perfect. A few squeaks here, a bow hair straying there, but that's not what the room heard. They heard truth, the kind you can't fake, the kind that climbs out of silence and refuses to sit back down. Her final passage slowed, the melody folding inward like a prayer. Her bow trembled slightly at the end, drawing out the last note until it barely registered, just vibration and air. And then, nothing. Not a sound, not even a breath. The music hung there for a moment, like the room itself was unsure how to return to reality. Amara stayed frozen, her bow hovering, eyes still closed, as if afraid that opening them would break whatever spell she'd just cast. Because it wasn't just a performance. It was a reclamation, and no one in that room would ever forget it. The final note had vanished, but its echo lingered like heat after lightning. Amara's bow hovered mid-air, suspended above the strings, her breath held tight in her chest. She didn't move, didn't look up. The silence that followed wasn't awkward or empty. It was reverent, heavy, sacred. A room full of people who'd been sipping overpriced wine and trading business cards, now sat perfectly still, held captive, not by force but by feeling. One woman near the front dabbed at her cheek with a cloth napkin, quietly, like she didn't want to disturb the residue of the music. A man in a tailored navy suit blinked hard, his jaw shifting as if trying to swallow whatever emotion had crept up on him. A teenage girl at a table by the wall clutched her mother's hand without saying a word. Even the kitchen, usually clattering and chaotic, had gone silent, chefs and dishwashers peeking through the swinging door, wide-eyed and breathless. Somewhere near the bar, someone exhaled audibly, as if they'd been holding it the entire time. And Warren Kingsley, he was still too. No smirk, no clever quip waiting. Just him, arms crossed now, eyes unreadable, something unsettled flickering across his carefully curated confidence. The laugh lines around his mouth had softened, like they'd been forgotten. He wasn't the center of the room anymore. She was. Amara lowered the bow slowly, her fingers relaxed but trembling. Her heart thudded in her ears, louder than the strings had ever been. She hadn't looked up since the first note. She hadn't dared. But now, as the silence stretched into something living, something raw and true, she opened her eyes, and met the room. Dozens of faces staring back. Some stunned, some searching, none indifferent. The applause hadn't started yet, because no one wanted to be the one to break the spell. They were caught between awe and guilt, between admiration and something they couldn't quite name. For a few seconds more it was just her and the truth she had laid bare in the middle of fine dining and whispered status. She hadn't played to impress. She had played to release, and the room had felt it. The power wasn't in the perfection of her notes. It was in the honesty of them. And for once, everyone listened, not because they had to, but because they didn't know how not to. The first clap came from the back, tentative, almost shy. Then another, then 5 more. Then the room erupted. Not the polite, lukewarm kind of applause that filled Bellamy's on jazz nights or anniversaries. This was something deeper, fuller, a release. Diners stood from their chairs without thinking, napkins falling to the floor, hands meeting in a rhythm that grew louder with every second. The kind of applause born not from entertainment, but from revelation. Amara sat still at the piano bench, her hands resting gently on the wood, her breath finally easing. She didn't smile. Not yet. She just looked out over the crowd, watching the walls come down on faces that had, until minutes ago, been wrapped in indifference or idle judgment. Some clapped with tears on their cheeks, others just stood frozen, their applause mechanical, stunned into movement by the collective swell. Her co-workers along the edge of the dining room exchanged wide-eyed glances, and Terence from the bar gave a low whistle, shaking his head like he'd just witnessed a miracle. And at the center of it all, Warren Kingsley. He didn't stand, not right away. He clapped, yes, but slowly, deliberately. The sound sharp, but hollow. His smile was gone, replaced by a stiff, unreadable mask that didn't quite fit. His eyes, once predatory and smug, darted from face to face, trying to read the room. But the room wasn't looking at him. No one was. All the power he carried in his watch, his voice, his name, it had vanished. And in its place was silence. The kind aimed at him, not from him. He shifted in his seat, straightened his cuffs, adjusted his collar, like he could smooth away the weight pressing down on him. But it didn't move. It stayed, because everyone saw it now. He wasn't in control anymore. Amara had taken that from him without a single word. The applause began to slow, but the energy remained. Not a buzz, but a pulse. The kind that stayed in your chest long after the moment passed. Warren finally rose, his motions too rehearsed to feel sincere. He gave 2 final claps, then dropped his hands to his sides, eyes avoiding hers. A man beside him whispered something, but Warren didn't respond. There was nothing clever left to say. She had stolen the narrative. Not with bravado, not with defiance, with grace. And everyone in that room, every last guest, server, manager, knew exactly who had the real power. It wasn't the man with the money. It was the woman with the violin. The applause faded into a low hum of murmurs and wonder, like people trying to process something too beautiful, too unexpected, to fit neatly back into their night. Amara stood slowly, the violin still in her hand, the bow resting against her side, like an extension of her breath. She didn't bow, didn't gesture for more praise. She didn't need to. She stepped away from the piano with the quiet dignity of someone who had nothing left to prove. As she made her way back through the dining room, chairs parted without being asked. Diners leaned back, clearing space like royalty was passing, not out of obligation, but reverence. Some nodded, others simply watched her with the kind of gaze reserved for things they knew they'd remember, not just later, forever. And then she passed Warren's table. He sat stiffly, drink untouched, his entourage unusually quiet, like men who had just witnessed their king fall and weren't sure how to mourn it. He adjusted his cuff again, then cleared his throat, loud enough to cut through the tension. "Well," he said with a crooked, forced smile, "you've clearly missed your calling, sweetheart." The word sweetheart again, this time thinner, desperate. He wanted to reassert himself, take back even a sliver of ground. Amara stopped. She turned, just enough to face him fully. No smile, no sarcasm, just truth. "You wanted a show," she said, her voice low and calm. "I gave you a glimpse of who I really am." The weight of it landed like a final note, measured, clear, and impossible to ignore. Warren blinked, caught off guard. The smirk didn't return. Amara didn't wait for a response. She turned and kept walking, spine tall, each step more certain than the last. She didn't hear laughter, no nervous clapping, just silence. And the silence said more than anything Warren could have mustered. She passed her co-workers near the bar. Terence gave her a quiet nod. No words, just respect. One of the hostesses mouthed, "That was beautiful," but Amara didn't slow down, because something had shifted. Not just in the room. In her. She didn't feel small anymore. Didn't feel like the girl with dreams shelved behind rent and duty. She felt seen, not for what she served, but for what she carried. The violin was still in her hand, as she disappeared through the kitchen doors, the case waiting where she'd left it. But now it didn't feel like a secret. It felt like a beginning. The dinner rush was over. Tables were being reset, wine glasses stacked into silent towers, and the soft hum of a closing shift settled into the bones of Bellamy's. Amara stood at the hostess stand, violin case in one hand, coat draped over the other. Her body ached with the familiar fatigue of long hours and polite smiles. But tonight, something underneath the tiredness glowed warm and steady. She had just stepped toward the exit when a voice stopped her. "Excuse me." She turned. A man in a charcoal blazer stood near the door, his scarf tucked neatly into his collar, a quiet curiosity in his eyes. He wasn't flashy, wasn't smiling for effect. Just still, intent. "I was sitting near the back," he said, motioning gently over his shoulder. "That was your piece, wasn't it?" She hesitated. "Yes." He nodded, thoughtful, then extended his hand. "Marcus Lane. I teach violin up in Atlanta. Been doing it 23 years, and I've heard a lot of talent walk into my studio, but I haven't heard something like that in a long time." Amara blinked. She wasn't sure what to say. Compliments were one thing, but this felt different, measured, real. He didn't wait for her to respond. "I run a small program for young composers," he continued. "We record original work, studio sessions, mentorship, the whole deal. It's not flashy, but it's honest. And what you played tonight, that deserves to be heard." She stared at him, half expecting a punchline that never came. "I'm not looking for a prodigy," he added. "I'm looking for truth, and you have it. If you're interested, we should talk." She nodded slowly, a quiet yes, not loud, not wide-eyed, but firm. A week later, she stood in a modest Atlanta studio, headphones slipping over her curls, the same worn violin cradled under her chin. The room smelled like old vinyl and pine resin. The sound engineer behind the glass gave her a thumbs up. The red light blinked, and she began to play. Not to prove anything, not to erase the night she was mocked, but because she had something worth sharing, something that had waited too long in the back of a restaurant break room. Her fingers moved with purpose. Her bow drew breath from wood. And this time, the silence that followed her final note wasn't filled with hesitation. It was filled with arrival. Because standing in that studio, surrounded by cables and sound foam and possibility, Amara understood something deeply, undeniably true. The moment that nearly broke her was the one that finally opened the door. If Amara's story moved you, share it. Share it for every unheard voice, every buried dream, every quiet soul waiting to be seen. Subscribe for more powerful stories like this. Tell us in the comments, have you ever been underestimated, until you showed who you really are? Your voice matters here. Let it rise.